There's a crocodile with a clock in its stomach chasing you, and it could easily turn you into a tyrant. It can turn you into a tyrant or a cowering victim or a hero. Those are the options fundamentally. So, and that's the Gorgon looking at her own, the Medusa looking at her own reflection, you know, Mother Nature with the head full of snakes, you know, a terrifying vision. And that's actually to some degree an archetype that men get confused with women. And you know, that's the witchy part of women, and that's the part that's attractive, but rejecting. And so many men are petrified by women. They won't approach them at all. They have no idea how to talk to them. They're just petrified into immobility. And that's way more common than you think. And so that breeds resentment like you wouldn't believe, you know. And that's the problem too. If you're chronically rejected by people, it's often because of your own insufficiencies. You know, whether that's cowardice or lack of social skills or whatever it is. It's like, you can't just brush it off as, oh well, you know, no one likes me, but really I'm okay. It's like, no, wrong. If everyone rejects you, there's probably something wrong. And it's probably deep and difficult, and it's going to be horrible to fix. And so, this isn't a trivial problem. It's not a trivial problem at all. And so, you know, that's Mother Nature for men too, because from the sexual selection point of view, if they're not selected as a mate, nature has taken them out of the game, right? And so, you know, people don't really like that. They're not that happy with that. And so, but getting all whiny about it and then getting violent is like, that's just not really very helpful, although it's very common. So, this is Lynn Isabel. An evolutionary arms race between early snakes and mammals triggered the development of improved vision and large brain in primates, a radical new theory suggests. These are old representations. I really like this one. This is, I don't remember, I think it's Greek, but it doesn't exactly look Greek. It might be older. It doesn't matter anyways. You see, it's the same thing, same idea as Graham's dream, right? It's like there's this thing that exists, this multi-headed snake, and it's got this infinity problem. It's everywhere. That's that little circle down there. And the problem is, well, what do you do with it? You cut off one head, 7 more grow. That's the eternal problem of life. And the problem is, there is the category of problems in life, and it ain't going anywhere. And so the question is, can you deal with the whole category at the same time? That's the thing. That's how to be in the world, is to deal with that category all at the same time. And so how did human beings, what did they come up with as a solution? And that's so cool too, because the solution they come up with not only was the heroism that allows you to approach what you're terrified by and what you find offensive and to learn from it, but also the idea of sacrifice, and that was played out by cultures everywhere, including human sacrifice. And you think, what the hell was up with those crazy bastards so long ago? They were sacrificing to gods all the time. What kind of clueless behavior was that? Burn something and please God. Burn something valuable and please God. It's like, what was with them? What were they thinking? Well, they weren't stupid, those people. If they were stupid, we wouldn't be here. They were not stupid, and believe me, they lived under a lot harsher conditions than we do. So those were some tough people, man. You know, back then you'd last about 15 minutes, and so you don't want to be thinking of your ancestors as stupid. Like, there's no real evidence that we're much different cognitively than we were 150,000 years ago. So anyways, sacrifice. What does that mean, sacrifice? Well, it's a discovery, man. It's the discovery of the future. It's like the future is actually the place where there is threat, and it's always going to be there. So what do? You make sacrifices in the present so that the future is better. Right. Everyone does that. That's what you're doing right now. That's what you're doing here. That's what your parents are doing when they pay money to send you to university. They think, you can bargain with reality. It's amazing. You can bargain with reality. You can forestall gratification now, and it'll pay off at a place and time that doesn't even exist yet. It's like, who would have believed that? It's like, that's a miracle that occurs. And it's not like people just figured that out overnight. How are we going to come up with an idea like that? Well, it's like, well, we thought about it for 7 million years. And, you know, we got to the point where we could kind of act it out. But we didn't know what we were doing. But it emerged as like a dream. So the terror of the future is a dream. And the solution to the dream of the future is another dream. And it comes out in mythology and in fantasy and in drama, where you act out the sacrifice. And then it's a step on the way to full understanding. So we can say sacrifice now instead of doing it, although we still do it. It's just not concretized like it used to be. We do it abstractly. And we all have faith that it will work, and we also set up our societies so that it'll work. And one thing about, I'm not a fan of moral relativism for a variety of reasons, partly because I think it's an extreme form of cowardice. But anyways, apart from that, no. There's minimal ways that you can set up a society that will work. And so one of them is that the society has to be set up so that your sacrifices will pay off, or you won't work, and then the society will die. And so it has to make promises. People have to make promises to one another. And that's what money is. Money is a promise that your sacrifice will pay off in the future. That's what money is. And so if the society is stable, you can store up your work right now, you can sacrifice your impulses, and you can work, and you can store up credit for the future, and then you can make the future a better place. But society has to be stable enough to allow for that. Hyperinflation will do you in. So the promise that's implicit in the currency is the promise that what you're doing now will pay off in the future. And if people don't have that promise, then, well, we know what they do. Because in gangs, for example, in say gangs in North America, the time horizon of the gang members shrinks rapidly because they don't really expect to be alive much past 21. And so they get really impulsive and violent, and like, why the hell not? That's what you do when the future doesn't matter, when it's not real. You default back to living in the moment, and you take what you can get right now. And no wonder, because you don't know if you're going to be around in a year. And you get whatever you can while you can bloody well get it. And that's like anarchy, that state. And so you don't want to live in, some people like to live in that state because they're really wired for that, And so they're much more comfortable in those conditions. They're kind of like warrior types, I would say, in some sense. But, for most people, that's just, well, that stress will just do you in, the stress of a life like that. So that's a pretty horrible picture, the one on the right, I think. And, it's a creepy picture. And don't you think? It seems like a creepy picture to me. Yeah, and so that's Quetzalcoatl, if I remember correctly, who was an Aztec dragon god. And that's the eye of Horus, by the way, this little thing here. And see, the Egyptians, they worshiped the eye. Yeah, well, that's cool, because, why did they worship the eye? Well, wake the hell up and look at the world. That's your salvation, to do that. Pay bloody attention, especially to the things you don't want to pay attention to. And use your vision. Have some vision. And you can use your vision to see into the future. And that's your redemption. And the Egyptians, they didn't know how to say that, but they knew how to represent it. And that's how they represented it. Like, the pupil on that is completely open, completely dilated. And that's a god as far as the Egyptians were concerned. It's Horus, and I'll tell you Horus' story at some point. So, early primates developed a better eye for color, detail, and movement, and the ability to see in 3 dimensions. Traits that are important for detecting threats at close range. Humans are descended from these same primates. All right. So, now, the initiation. Well, when you go into psychotherapy, or when you make any supreme moral effort, which is roughly the same thing, you have to confront that which you do not know. Now, I mentioned the pre-cosmogonic chaos and the idea that at the end of Jung's life, he sort of thought of the unconscious and the world as the same. And you think, what the hell does that mean? But here's what it means. So let's say you're in a long-term intimate relationship and you get betrayed. Okay, so what is it that you see when you see your partner at the moment you know of the betrayal? Well, you see the pre-cosmogonic chaos. And here's why. Well, it rattles your unconscious up because you don't know anything anymore. You don't know what the past was, right? You don't know what it was. And it's supposed to be real, and all of a sudden you don't know what it was. And so you come up with wild ideas about what it might have been and what it represented, and then you don't know what the future is going to be anymore. So then your fantasy fills that space, and you don't know who the hell you're looking at, that's for sure, and you don't know much about human beings, and you certainly don't know anything about yourself. And so all of a sudden, not only is everything in chaos inside your mind, but everything is in chaos in your world. And it actually is, and there's no telling the difference between those two things. You know, and so then you're just shattered. And so then you go talk to a therapist for like 2 years and you think, well, what happened? What was the reality? And the reality is, because who knows what the reality was, like, but as far as you're concerned, the reality is, I better represent this properly in my head. I better figure out who I was, who that person was, what we did together, and what it meant, because I do not want this to happen again. And so you're healed when you get to the point where you've grasped the bloody moral of the story. What went wrong? And how can I not have that happen again? Because that's the purpose of learning, right? That's the purpose of memory. It's to prepare you for the future. And so you have to pull out of that massive chaos a functional representation that increases your wisdom so that you're not this naive target the next time you enter into a relationship. So at least you can have another relationship without being so traumatized that, you know, you're done. And you know, it can take people years to talk that through, because this landscape of potential opens up when they're betrayed. It's like, well, anything could have been the truth. Well, to sort through that, you have to wander through all that mess, and it's really painful and emotional as well. You have to sort through all that mess to come out with the new you, right? The renewed you. There's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper, or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object, like the phoenix in some sense, that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal, and so King Arthur's knights, who sit at a round table because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing, and where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And that's why there's, you know, an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites. And the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character. And so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, you know, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, you know, and maybe he could stop a locomotive, but by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, you know, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, you know, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God, and that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and, you know, so then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite, you know. So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot. And that's something to think about, you know. There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, you know, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea. So anyways, one of the main characters is the country, the known, the explored territory. We went over that a bit, and it always has two elements. I mean, your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction. And so it's really tyrannical, but at the same time it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant or the bad tyrant and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously, you know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. And he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing. So, you know, Peter Pan, that's a great story. It's a great mythological story. So, well, so let's talk about tyrants. Well, not only are they mythological figures, but they exist, and they tend to be deified. I mean, Stalin was, for all intents and purposes, God the Father in Soviet Russia, although he was pretty much only the worst elements of Old Testament God, who was, you know, constantly smiting people and wiping out populations and doing all sorts of things that seemed to be quite nasty. But nonetheless, you know, people worshipped him in many ways, and he's a representation of just exactly what goes wrong when things really go wrong, when people stop paying attention and when they all lie, because one of the things that characterized the communist state was that no one ever got to say anything they actually believed, ever. And that was partly because 1 out of 3 people was an informer, which meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were informing on the government about you, and that included your own children. And if you were an informer, you were often amply rewarded by the state, so that if you lived in an overcrowded apartment building with 3 families in the same flat and you informed on, you know, the woman down the hall that you didn't like, she got shipped off to the old concentration camp and you got her apartment. And so that was a lovely society, and it only killed about 30 million people between 1919 and 1959. So that's what happens when the archetypal structure gets tilted badly, when people forget that they have a responsibility to fulfill as citizens, as awake citizens who are capable of stating the truth, and the archetype shifts, so there's nothing left of the great father except the tyrant, and let's not have that happen. I mean, the one on the right is really interesting because consciously or unconsciously, you know, there's Stellan surrounded by what is, for all intents and purposes, fire. You know, he looks like Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty when she shows up at Aurora's christening. You know, she puts her arms up in the air and green fire surrounds her. It's like he's surrounded by fire, and there's Lenin above him who's like king of the fiery realm, and that's for sure. So I mean, all the terrors that happened in the Soviet Union didn't start under Stalin, they started under Lenin, and Stalin was definitely Lenin's legitimate son, let's put it that way.